How's everyone doing? I know it's late in the day. Okay. So my name is Gaius, and today we'll be talking about some ideas around struggle and power and how that affects how we think about programming languages. The title of this talk is Linguistic Domination and Translation as a Counter-Hegemonic Practice. My mom's an English teacher, so I like big words, I guess. But more importantly, I think, let's kind of start with who I am. I work at a company called MailChimp in Atlanta, Georgia. MailChimp's the world-leading automation platform for small businesses. In addition, I also help organize the Atlanta Elixir meetup, and I've done so for the past 2 years. Last year, some of you may recall, I gave a talk here entitled Why Elixir Matters, a Genealogy of Functional Programming. As Jim mentioned, that talk then led to other talks of a similar vein. And in that talk, I charted the historical development of functional languages. And together we examined the history of functional programming from lambda calculus in the 1930s to the ascent of Elixir today. I argued that the success of Elixir will be marked by how we learn from those mistakes historically made by the functional programming community. More importantly, I presented strategies for the Elixir community which centered around community building and that was based on real-world experiences as well as historical analysis. That real-world experience resides in my own experience running the Elixir meetup for the past 2 years and teaching local workshops. And some of these workshops were being taught to boot camp students who, for the majority, have never encountered functional programming. Moreover, it stems from my time as an engineer at a startup called Luma, building systems to manage over 100,000 consumer devices, all using Elixir. That experience taught me that choosing functional programming often has social costs. This talk picks up where that talk ended in a way. This talk argues that the social costs of functional programming are due to the fact that object-oriented programming maintains hegemony. It charts the rise of object-oriented programming's hegemony. It then examines the instances of hegemonic power, most notably in technical interviews and accepted design patterns. And lastly, this talk offers code translation as one strategy for counter-hegemonic resistance. To be honest, I wrestled, although excited that Jim offered me a chance to keynote here at a conference that I attended and really enjoyed last year. I wrestled with giving a talk of this nature for several reasons. For one, I'm also not as a minority in technology, I feel certain oddness for giving what is sometimes considered a soft talk. But the other reason I wrestle with this is that I no longer write Elixir as my day job. After spending years doing functional programming, I took a job writing object-oriented code, honestly because the last company I worked for went out of business. And although I work in consulting projects on the side using Elixir, it is no longer how I derive most of my income. More importantly, I've been faced with the reality of object-oriented programming's pervasiveness in the sort of average typical workplace. Put more finely, most folks don't even know what functional programming is or why it matters. So I struggle with giving a talk of this nature because it leans towards the philosophical or towards the abstract. So, I'll give you a forewarning. We'll look at some code, enough to address my fears that this talk is not technical enough. But in some ways, that's the point, right? The point is that the challenges we face as a community are not primarily technical any longer. The problem we face is not that we don't have a library to do X. The challenges we faced are social technical, if technical at all. So with that in mind, this talk proceeds as follows. First, we'll examine what I mean by hegemony and how object-oriented programming attained it. Following that, we'll examine several instances of object-oriented programming's hegemonic power. We'll then conclude by evaluating means of resisting the status quo's power, and in particular, we'll focus on how individualized resistance in the context of programming interviews can be quite useful. So let's talk about hegemony. The term hegemony originates in the 16th century and stems from the Greek word hegemonia. It can be formally defined as domination, influence, or authority over another, especially by one group, usually a political group, over a society or by one nation over others. Moreover, it represents dominance of one social group over another such that the ruling group or hegemon acquires some degree of consent from the subordinate as opposed to dominance purely by force. We'll return to this idea of consent later because I think it's particularly interesting. Hegemony in the literature resides in two schools of thought. In international relations theory, hegemony describes one nation's dominance over another. For instance, the United States maintains hegemony over all other states in the world due to our superior military technology. The US, as the current hegemon, remains functionally different, and we are expected to secure and stabilize the rest of the world using that power. More importantly, a challenge to our hegemony by, let's say, Russia or China will be designated as an act of war, whether that's a Cold War or hot war in the conventional sense. The strain of hegemony that most interests me, though, resides in the work of the Italian theorist Antonio Gramsci. Benito Mussolini, the leader of the National Fascist Party, imprisoned Gramsci for most of his life, which I think makes Gramsci's work particularly interesting. While in prison, Gramsci defined cultural hegemony as the domination of a diverse society by a ruling class who controls the beliefs and perceptions. Cultural hegemony results in a status quo where the ruling class has a worldview or paradigm that becomes the accepted cultural norm. This subsequently justifies the status quo as both inevitable and natural. More importantly, hegemony leads us to believe that the current paradigm is beneficial for everyone rather than being an artificial social construct that benefits only the hegemon. Put simply, Gramsci for hegemony operates not through physical force, rather it operates in the terrain of ideas and knowledge and elicits consent from all. It requires domination within what Gramsci calls civil society, that is, the media, the church, the educational institutions. Last year, I also referenced instantiations of power in the work of a French sociologist called Michel Foucault, and I think it's worth reiterating here. Hegemony and power operates at best by getting individuals, you and I, to buy in and to self-police, rather than by using force to coerce us. A particular variant of cultural hegemony that's interesting to me is linguistic hegemony. In the literature, linguistic hegemony is defined by some sort of hegemony that operates by entrenching one particular language as the lingua franca. Both international relations theorists and sociologists agree that English, as a global language, gives the United States tremendous, quote-unquote, soft power. In fact, some theorists like Joseph Nye argue that soft power is all we need. The pervasiveness of the English language in American culture means that we do not any longer have to physically dominate the world. Instead, the transmission of our culture and values does the work for us. For instance, although I was born and raised in Nigeria, I, like the most of my childhood Nigerian friends, do not speak our mother tongue, right? I went home recently and I couldn't say any words in my mother's language or my father's language because I only speak English. This is a unique case where the English language has sort of pervaded the culture around the globe, and we no longer have to physically enforce it. This understanding of hegemony provides us with a framework for beginning to understand what is at stake with regards to the hegemony of object-oriented programming. Object-oriented programming attained hegemony in the late 20th century and has not relinquished it. Object-oriented languages stand out as the lingua franca, and the ideas that stem from them dominate the narrative around programming. Moreover, as the widespread language of choice for educators, object-oriented languages elicit consent from computer scientists at an early age. On the surface, the hegemony of object-oriented languages is clear. When we look at the top 15 languages today, they're all steeped in that paradigm. Even more alarmingly, if we define dominance as the availability of jobs as we did last year, we come to the conclusion that object-oriented languages are the ruling class. However, I am not particularly interested in the popularity of languages, although it does establish their collective status as lingua franca. Rather, I am more interested in the way in which their dominance manifests itself and excludes other forms of thought, namely the functional paradigm. To examine this particular form of dominance, it is important to take note of the fact that Java's rise operated through soft power. In other words, no one forced people to write Java or physically hurt them if they did not write Java, right? Its proliferation can be related to the spread of the English language by the British Empire. This spread did not occur by force, but rather by hegemonic consent. In a 2001 address, Eric Schmidt, the former vice president of Sun Microsystems and later chairman at Google, defines Java's ascent as being part of a quote-unquote war to establish dominance. Although Java failed as a desktop language, it survived as a mid-tier server-side language. In other words, Java really was meant, or at least in the case of Sun Microsystems, their goal was to have Java win as a browser language, which, as we all know, it did not succeed in doing so. However, it survived as a mid-tier server-side language for building business applications, so on and so forth. Schmidt admits that Sun, quote-unquote, used the press to make Java a tremendous marketing success. News clippings from the archive corroborate his point. The use of the media echoes Gramsci's point that the media is instrumental in establishing dominance in civil society. Java, and by extension Microsoft, use the media to help establish its dominance as the paradigm of choice. And I think this is interesting because, here we have a clipping from the San Jose Mercury News, and this is a front page article. Actually, this isn't a front page article, but there were many of these kinds of articles on the front page of newspapers in the early 90s and the mid 90s that sort of heralded Sun as sort of this, transcendent technology that was going to save the world and make all of programming necessarily better than it was in the past. And I think this is interesting because you see Sun Microsystems and the community really leveraging the media, not just sort of the programming media, but the media more generally. I think this echoes Brian's point, right, in the sense that Sun Microsystems was really good at talking to people who were not programmers. They were really good at talking to people who were decision makers, business owners, and they sort of started from winning that war rather than by trying to win the war of technology. Another article that's very similar here, we find sort of this rave glorification of Java to non-programmers, right? Heralded as this sort of universal software language that would solve all the world's problems. So now that we have a framework for understanding cultural hegemony, and particularly object-oriented programming's place within it, let's turn to two instances of hegemony in particular. The first, in the late 2000s, while at Google, Eric Schmidt coined a term called the Big Four. Alternatively known as GAFA, the Big Four refers to the four multinational technology companies Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple. For Schmidt, these players represent the driving forces in today's technology landscape. As a software engineer, they represent the ideal places to work. Films like The Internship, starring Owen Wilson and Vince Vaughn, great film by the way, echo the cultural sentiment that the Big Four are these idyllic places to work, free lunch, free dinner, beautiful people, all that. Put simply, they are where the smartest and brightest go to work. However, you cannot get a job at the Big Four tech companies if you do not know object-oriented programming. While they may say that, they may say you don't need to know these things, the reality of it is that you do, right? And more importantly, you are encouraged to interview in an object-oriented programming language. Thus, it is in your best interest to learn such a language, even if you do not know or like the paradigm. At face value, this nudge towards object-oriented programming at the interview stage is a hegemonic move. Let's be clear, getting a job at the Big Four provides significant benefits to you as a software engineer. It means more compensation, greater possibilities for career advancement. More importantly, it makes your parents happy. If they are immigrant Nigerian parents like mine, they will probably call your aunts and uncles and tell them that your child has gotten a job at Google. Moreover, LeetCode, the leading interview prep portal for the Big Four, only offers 4 pseudo-functional languages out of its 14 options, right? However, if we exclude languages like Rust, Scala, Kotlin, and Swift, and only include languages that are truly functional, we are left with 0 options on the list of languages that LeetCode lets you practice in. Put simply, LeetCode only supports practicing in object-oriented programming languages. More interestingly, LeetCode defaults users to C++, and I think this erasure of the functional paradigm does not reflect on LeetCode alone. It's a great piece of software, you should totally use it. I have a subscription. But rather, it speaks to the nature of programming interviews at the Big Four. The programming interview qua test remains a powerful and efficient tool through which object-oriented programming imposes discipline. For Michel Foucault, the test is an important sort of facet in civil society because they offer the ability to observe, perform surveillance, quantify, classify, normalize, judge, and of course punish. Foucault argues that tests are used by the ruling class, quote, for controlling the educational system and the behavior of those who are affected by the test results. There has been a general outcry in recent years to the sort of whiteboard style of coding tests. Studies have shown that they are not evidence of good programming skills, and in fact, they demonstrate the opposite. However, what interests me is the fact that these tests are not useful for evaluating a developer's ability to write software. There are too many studies that prove that they are useless for us to debate whether or not they're useless. Rather, what's interesting about the acceptance that they are useless is that they have no function aside from being a tool to discipline and to determine your allegiance to the object-oriented programming paradigm. Put simply, if the test does not prove that you're a good programmer, its purpose is purely social. This brings me to the Gang of Four, which is ironic that they would be called a gang. The second instance of hegemony that I want to examine lies in the pervasiveness of object-oriented design patterns. By the Gang of Four, I'm of course referring to the four authors of the book Design Patterns, Elements of Reusable Object-Oriented Software. The book lays out several key design patterns for building object-oriented software. The book draws extensive criticism from folks in the dynamic and functional language conferences, so I won't belabor the point here. What interests me instead is the pervasiveness of the patterns in colleges and programming interviews. Put simply, the patterns laid out in the book, i.e. the strategy and the visitor pattern, are considered the definition of good programming. Such a widespread acceptance of a paradigm represents a hegemonic move. It is not just that the Gang of Four are popular, it is more so that not having mastery or knowledge of these patterns is considered a weakness for the majority of most working programmers. Now, one could argue that these patterns are useful. Nevertheless, I believe that the question should be whether or not they are necessary and inevitable. The pervasive idea that they are desirable and inevitable, and the fact that you have to use them at some point, moves them from the realm of utility, something you probably should know, into the realm of hegemonic and paradigmatic dominance. What does it mean to have design patterns that are not always already object-oriented? Do we even need design patterns? Moreover, what does it mean to be an engineer if you do not use these patterns? Are you less of an engineer? This, of course, brings us to resistance, right? We know that the status quo is problematic. We know that it's really hard to get a job at Google if you don't know Java. But how do you begin to resist this, right? So now we have this sort of framework. I would like to begin sketching out what I think of as a possible mode of counter-hegemonic resistance. Gramsci's work instructs us that direct struggle is limited and often counterproductive. He argues that a quote-unquote war of attack cannot succeed without a war of position. This war of position takes the form of a struggle over ideas and beliefs. In order to counter hegemony for Gramsci, we must constantly represent and present alternatives to dominant ideas of what is normal and broadly acceptable. In fact, the common refrain that there is no alternative is the first claim that must be debunked. It is paramount to think through what strategies the functional programmer can utilize to destabilize and resist object-oriented programming. Over the past few years, I've wrestled precisely with this question. How do I resist, while educating others? How do I resist when talking to someone who doesn't know what functional programming is? How do I resist when working in a workplace where I have to care about my coworkers who have not drank the proverbial Kool-Aid of functional programming? Due to the fact that I worked at a few well-known AI labs as an undergrad, I somehow found myself on Google's list of potential recruits my senior year in college. This is great because it's very flattering for Google to cold email you and say you should come and interview with us. But it's also strange because I don't know how to get out of the email list. So over the past few years, I've sort of constantly declined an interview for several reasons. I don't have time. I don't want to move to California. It's too expensive. However, if I'm honest, the real reason that I'm highly not motivated to interview is because I dislike the interview approach. I fundamentally disagree that it accurately measures intelligence properly. Moreover, as someone who has not written Java in years, it strikes me as odd that I'm required, asked, nudged, however you want to phrase it, to learn Java or a similar language for one interview without a guaranteed job. Put simply, I feel inadequate every time I think of the Google interview. Nevertheless, I decided recently to interview at Google because I believe that you should conquer your fears and you should cross the aisle. I initially started by relearning Java. I did this by working through some exercises while I was in Nigeria recently, and I started working through exercises in the book Cracking the Coding Interview by Gail Larkman and McDowell. I spent about 2 weeks sort of initially learning Java and getting reacclimated with the problem sets. At some point, it struck me that I was missing an opportunity to utilize my knowledge of functional programming, and I paused because I had already been encouraged by my recruiter many times, like, hey, you should learn Java. And I was like, I don't know Java. Well, you should probably learn Java. But it wasn't, it wasn't a definite thing. It wasn't like if you don't learn Java, don't come here. It was more like, you probably should do this. Kind of how the mob encourages you to give them money. So I decided to interview in Elixir instead. To do so, I began resolving or translating the exercises that I worked on. So taking my solutions to these problems and translating them to Elixir. At first, I struggled a great deal because I was used to thinking of the problems in the book imperatively, right? Because I was used to thinking of the problems in Java. But moreover, I was worried that I'd be penalized for not solving the problems in Java. But then I remembered that I already have a job and I like my job a lot and that I was mostly doing this for research purposes. For instance, there's a popular problem that on LeetCode is considered like highly popular and hard. And it asks you to implement a least recently used cache. We are told to implement the data structure to support the following operations: get and of course put. The operation should occur at worst in O of 1 or constant time. In Java, I solved this using a hash map that kept track of the keys and kept the values in a doubly linked list. That results in an O of 1 time for put and get operations and lets us remove the first node in constant time as well. When implementing the solution in Elixir, I utilized an agent to keep track of state. In this case, I kept the order of the least recently used items in a queue, and then I kept a map of the keys. Simple enough. Then the next thing I did was I implemented the get operation, again, using that queue and also using that map to simply retrieve the things I wanted to and then returning -1 when they didn't exist. And then I would also update the cache, or update the cache with the queue that had been changed so that the most recently used item moved to the position necessary. Now, after implementing this solution, which most of you, I'm sure would think of as like fairly straightforward, I felt that I had done a good job of converting my solution and proving to myself that I could walk into this interview and say, well, this does the thing that you think makes me a smart programmer. However, I recalled something, which was that the exercise asked for O of 1 insertion and lookup. I then sort of recalled from like my days in the Clojure world that O of 1 is not really possible with the data structures that are built into Elixir. So I started thinking about this. Well, Elixir maps are based on hash array map tries, originally popularized by Clojure's Rich Hickey, and HAMT is a structure for organizing arbitrary data in a broadly branching tree. They're really useful for building immutable hash maps in functional programming languages like ours. By using a hash code to represent a unique path in the tree, we can build a hash map on top of the tree rather than on an array-based table, as is commonly seen in Java, C++, and languages like that. What this allows for us to do is to grow that tree indefinitely without resizing or chaining. So you don't pay the penalties for rehashing. It also allows us to share a repeated structure between similar trees, right? So we can have our cake and eat it too. We can have immutability, but we can also have a nice data structure that allows for quick lookup. This means, technically speaking, the retrieval for an Elixir map will be logarithmic as opposed to the constant time performance offered by traditional implementations of the hash map. We could argue that since the log base is so large, the true cost in practice is not much worse than a traditional array-based hash map. However, I got stuck on this point for a while, right? It kind of came back to my earlier discussion of hegemony, right? Because now I'm freaking out. Like I've spent 2 weeks, working on Java stuff. Now spent like a week practicing this Elixir translation of it. But my thing is logarithmic. They want it constant. Does that mean I don't get a job? My true worry was that in an interview setting, I would be penalized and scolded for the fact that my solution was not constant time and that I couldn't take a hash array map try and make it constant time because that would violate the first principle of an immutable data structure. So I ventured on the path of like implementing a dictionary structure myself that maybe used shared access, but I quickly realized that I had encountered what I refer to as hegemony's underside. Put differently, I was staring at the object-oriented paradigm in the face, and its rules of analogy had become apparent. You see, my translation of the algorithm was radically different, even if it on the face seemed similar, right? Both pieces of code looked kind of similar in terms of how they worked. However, the use of a different data structure under the hood has rendered my solution more scalable precisely because it could now be shared between two processes without having to use a mutex or a lock or anything of that nature. The imperative and accepted solution could not without significant modification. In other words, you could not take the Java code that I wrote that solved this same problem and take that cache and then distribute it, right? You couldn't give people access to it. You'd have to keep that in a single thread. Although my solution does pay a small penalty, which in practice is not much slower and provides the added benefit of facilitating concurrency, I would be penalized within the paradigm of object-oriented programming, particularly at the level of the programming interview as test. However, my inability to see this demonstrated my own implicit bias for performance without accounting for the reality of use. Technically, the retrieval performance of our tree will be logarithmic as opposed to constant time performance offered by traditional implementation. However, that isn't the point. The point is that we have done better software engineering by building something immutable from day one that could then be shared, and then we could utilize that to scale our system, right? Because we build systems that people use, not toy programs that you use to win interviews. And to me, like when I really thought through that, I realized that proving in an interview that I needed, that I was intelligent based on this sort of odd rubric was in itself counterproductive to what the interview was supposed to prove, which is that I'm good at understanding trade-offs and solving problems for real users, right? And I think most Google engineers actually work on real problems, not toy problems. So I think what I discovered was that in my own thinking, I had somehow been led astray. As I reflected on the work that I had to do, I realized that even working in object-oriented languages, I often choose performance over runtime complexity. In fact, I am more than often concerned with scaling performance at sort of requests per second level than I am with the performance of an algorithm in isolation. Therefore, in reality, the object-oriented programming interview test enforces consent by performing a magic trick. Instead of thinking about performance in a real world, you are instead taught to think about performance in a random toy solution that could actually never be reused. It erases the concerns of building real systems and replaces them with rhetorical games of fancy that are not based in academic truth or even modern business problems. It does this not by forcing the programmer, right? Because remember, no one's gonna hit you for not solving this problem in constant time, but by convincing us, me really, that you are less intelligent if you cannot figure out how to make your share nothing system share everything. While innocuous at first glance, this form of discipline is dangerous because it breeds an entire class of self-effacing programmers who are incapable of operating outside the confines of that paradigm and make significant errors when actually consulted with the reality of systems that require massive scale. I think there's so many examples of systems going down in production, healthcare.gov, so on and so forth, where we can really examine them and say, did this solution really take into account real-world trade-offs and how to build systems, or are they just sort of based on fanciful ideas of how systems operate? After implementing the algorithm, I spent a few more days implementing some more algorithms and discovered that this rules of analogy was not isolated because most of the problems assume that you could achieve constant time by leveraging shared access. Generally speaking, an assumption in imperative programming questions is the solution need not be parallelized or even accessed by multiple processes. This, however, as I mentioned before, flies in the face of real-world problems. And it's precisely the opposite of what we want to do when we are hiring software engineers. The second exercise that I attempted was the translation of a common design pattern, because this is something that sort of comes up in these interviews. Is you'll sketch out a first solution, and then they'll then tell you, well, now can you refactor this solution to make it cleaner? And what they're really asking you is, can you pick one of the gang of 4 patterns in that book and use it? And if you don't, they're like, well, you've never read that book, which means you're not intelligent. One of these that comes up is the factory pattern, and I chose that one because I often see younger engineers or professors, in object-oriented shops or institutions applaud people's understanding of the factory pattern as this sign of maturity, and it's a big deal. I often see this pattern also used to simply return objects that do work or to return data. And so let's look at a factory in a sort of object-oriented sense that's responsible for producing an action to create an animal, right? In this case, what we're doing is we're sort of using the switch statement, and we're calling this in a factory. But really what it does, it says, give me some input, in this case, let's say a constant or a string, and I'm going to use that to do some action. In this case, I'm going to return a cat, a bird, or a rabbit. This is interesting because we can then take a look at sort of a rewrite of this in Elixir, and it's pretty straightforward, right? You just pattern match on the name of the thing, and you create several new functions that all just return the data you need. As you can see, the Elixir translation takes advantage of pattern matching, and if we needed to, we could just return closures if we need to do something fancy. The point I want to drive home is that the factory pattern is useless in a language that allows you to treat functions as first-class citizens or allows you to access something interesting like pattern matching. Moreover, the factory pattern actually creates code that sort of is bloated and engenders code that's hard to reason about, because you then have to figure out when you're in the model that actually does the thing, where the thing is actually being called, which means you now have to know about the model as well as a factory that uses it. And what to me is odd about this is there are so many examples where I've worked at several shops that write object-oriented software, and I, let's say, write something that does the job. Maybe it's composed of pure functions. And then I'm told, well, why don't you refactor this to use the factory pattern? And I often say, why should I use the factory pattern? And the answer usually isn't, well, the factory pattern will make this more reusable or nicer or cleaner. It's usually because the factory pattern was in this book, and this book is how we should do software, so you should do the factory pattern, right? And I think that circularity is precisely why hegemony is dangerous, because I think most object-oriented programmers cannot explain to you credibly why these patterns are useful, because they've always already assumed that the pattern is how you should write software. And I think this engenders object-oriented code that is way more complex, way more bloated, and bug-prone, because the patterns themselves do not actually provide value in most cases. The patterns are simply crutches. I think instead, and I think where Chicky kind of gets at this in many of his talks, is that one sort of useful thing about no longer having the cruft of objects is that you're instead forced to deal with data and functions, right? So if you have to do something, and similar to in this case, I have to return something that's of the type cat, I simply return a map or a struct that defines that thing, right? I'm interested more in the thing, which means as a programmer, I am doing the work of programming rather than the work of faux intellectualism. So I'd like to conclude by pointing out that I do not believe that object-oriented languages are bad. That may be hard for you to believe at this point, right? In fact, I believe that they are very useful and that the paradigm should be a tool in every developer's tool belt, right? Like if you don't know how OO works, or if you don't understand these patterns, then you're probably doing yourself a disservice. However, if we are to truly tackle the challenges that face us as software professionals today, we must be careful to resist the paradigmatic isolation and hegemony's underside. In other words, we must resist the complete domination by these languages. The status quo remains undesirable because the hegemony of these languages renders all other paradigms on thought or structurally adjusts them. And by structurally adjust, I mean it forces them to readjust to fit the existing paradigm. To put a finer point on it, and I think this echoes Brian's point earlier, we actually are in a war, right? And I think the fact that the Java community in the 1990s used this term war over and over again is actually very important, right? Because I think these communities, the .NET community in particular, which I spent a long time as part of, they see this as a war, right? They see the eradication of other languages as being useful and great. And any parts of your language that they think are interesting, they will steal. I think the example of like LINQ in .NET is interesting, right? Because the interest is not, or I think even F# is an interesting one, right? It is only interesting insofar as we can pull it into our own ecosystem and render those communities useless. And I think that thinking of these things as a war is very important as we move into the next stage, because that is the posture that these other languages and communities take, even if on the face it doesn't seem so. So the renewed interest in scalability and microservices, I believe, is an opportunity that we as a community must take seriously. This war is being fought in the realm of ideas and about resiliency and systems architecture. It's not a physical war, so I'm not encouraging anyone here to go like physically fight some Java developers. You'll probably lose, I think. I believe that the emergence and the ascent of languages like Go also advances the excitement for new ideas, right? People are really interested in scalability, resiliency, how to build services. In fact, most of these companies already have infrastructure around Docker, which means that it doesn't matter what language you're running, which then begs the question, why are you not running Elixir? So the question then is, what is our responsibility as functional programmers given the current zeitgeist associated with distributed systems? Given that we are here at a functional programming conference, I implore all of you to think through ways that you can begin to resist hegemony. For you, it may be convincing your already Dockerized shop that you should take one of those, instances of Kubernetes and maybe run Elixir on it. It may not be as extreme as showing up to an interview to write Elixir when you were supposed to write Java. It could be as simple as writing a non-imperative code, sort of recursive code in an imperative code base. It could mean attending an object-oriented meetup and educating folks about functional programming. Or if you're like me, it could be simply learning not to beat yourself up for having forgotten Java's weird parts. I implore you to continue to work as language enthusiasts, open source contributors, practitioners. Your collective effort contributes to a future in which linguistic equality could actually be a possibility. Until then, I encourage you to press forward towards the higher calling, and thank you.